Welcome to the ERLC podcast, where our goal is to help you think biblically about today's cultural issues. I'm Elizabeth Bristow, and today we're talking about expectations for the 2024 presidential election. Many of us sense that politics are contentious and messy. They often leave us feeling weary about the future of our country and its leaders. This was certainly the case in the 2020 presidential race. As our nation prepares for yet another presidential election in November, it's helpful for us to be aware of what's happening in our culture and have clear expectations for the season ahead, so that as Christians, we can be salt and light in our communities and engage politics with the hope of the gospel. On today's episode, you'll hear from Brooke Medina, who serves as Vice President of Communications for the John Locke Foundation and an ERLC Research Institute Fellow. You'll also hear from Yuval Levin, the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and Jason Thacker, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Research Institute at the ERLC. The 2024 presidential election has already begun to seem like a less than ideal repeat of 2016 and 2020. As the scene begins to unfold, Brooke Medina shares what most concerns her about the months to come and how we can be prepared for what promises to be a tight and contentious race.
I think a contentious few months is probably a very nice and gentle way to put it. We have the luxury of the knowledge of history to teach us that American politics has become contentious, but even more so because it feels in so many ways as if the stakes are exceedingly high and they feel like they're getting higher and higher, or at least that's how the politicians oftentimes will frame it. And so one of my chief concerns is, what does all of this rancor and these very divisive messages that we're hearing coming from many political candidates or PACs, what is that doing to the average voter in terms of their motivation to civically engage? And so, if anything, really, I would say my concerns center more around the voters and their desire to continue to engage. I think there's a lot of disenchantment going on right now, and it is in no small part because we have heard those escalated stakes always being brought to the fore, where it's just like, this is the most important election of your lifetime. And I think that there is a third way that we really could present some of these political problems we have while not denying the very real issues at stake, but still not essentially paralyzing Americans with fear in ways that really discourage their civic engagement in the future.
It is fear that often keeps us paralyzed from engaging in politics and the public square. When election results don't turn out the way we had hoped, we're tempted to retreat and can even question the legitimacy of American democracy. Here's Yuval Levin with more on how he foresees this presidential election playing out and how another close election could potentially lead to political unrest.
I worry most about yet another close election. Almost every election in the 21st century has been really exceptionally close and would have been considered before the 21st century an unusually tight race. And a lot of the problems that we've had in our political culture in the last 2 decades have been a function of those close elections. Close elections come to be treated as illegitimate by the losing side. We've seen that happen over and over since 2000. We've seen both sides do it, some worse than others, but in one way or another, each side that loses a tight race suggests that something was amiss. I think another close election, which is likely, would raise again the specter of challenges to the outcome, of challenges to the legitimacy of the system, ultimately of the Constitution. And there's a real possibility of those kinds of challenges pointing to genuine political violence and disorder. I think we've frankly been pretty lucky that there's not been all that much political violence in 21st century America. But our culture is awfully primed for it, and I don't think we should underestimate the possibility. The guardrails against it are weakened, and we shouldn't want to test them. So I would say that I'm less concerned about the contentious campaign than I am about the possibility of an outcome in November that is close enough to suggest to people that something is wrong with the process and that leads to real questions about the legitimacy of American democracy. What happens is that the losing side of a closely contested election insists that something was wrong, that it wasn't legitimate, that there was fraud, that there was some playing fast and loose with the administration of the election. Obviously, we saw that happen in 2020. In some ways, we saw it happen in 2016, when a lot of people on the losing side claimed that the Russians interfered or that for some other reasons there was something illegitimate about the outcome. We saw it in 2000, in some ways in 2004. And, I think every time this happens, we become accustomed to treating elections not as decisive, not as providing us with an outcome that sets the direction of the following 4 years, but as with the beginning of a fight, and rather than the end of a fight. And so I worry that another close election like that, when our political culture is so primed for it, and when the candidates are openly questioning one another's legitimacy, even now, would lead us to a point where people will not accept the result, and where you might see whether it's election officials refusing to certify, whether it's Congress refusing to accept the certification, whether it's just a political movement of the right or the left taking to the streets to say, no, that election did not go the way you say it did. We have not really had to face that in American life. We've come awfully close to it a couple of times in the last 20 years, but I think that if we really were up against it, we could be looking at a challenge to the legitimacy of an American election that, as I said, could really lead to political violence. And I think we have to worry about that in ways that ought to drive us to lower the temperature, to constrain our own assertions and claims, to stop going around saying this is the most important election in our lifetime. It's likely to be a close election, which means whoever wins is likely to have a narrow mandate and is not likely to be able to do all that much. And it's just not true that the entire future of our civilization depends on this election. Whatever happens, 5 years from now, you're going to be fine. And I think it's very important that that be conveyed as part of our political culture's way of speaking to itself. We've gotten awfully hysterical about elections, and we need to be a little bit more realistic about the dangers we confront if things go too far.
In Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37, Jesus says, I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. We have witnessed the power of words, specifically political rhetoric in recent presidential elections, and the negative effects it can have on relationships. Disagreements over politics have created divides between families and friends, even in the church, resulting in broken bonds of unity. Here's Brooke with how we can become more aware of the ways in which we talk to one another.
Our rhetoric and communication, I think that it can foster that toxic political environment, but it can also heal it if we are more careful in what we are saying. And we are looking at this as Christians from a posture of, how can I be a peacemaker in this moment? Something my pastor said several years ago that I continue to come back to is the difference between being a peacekeeper and a peacemaker, and how peacekeepers are just there kind of to maintain the status quo, make sure not too many feathers get ruffled and things are just kind of coasting along. A peacemaker, however, goes into the messiness of it all and these genuine ordeals and does the hard work of getting to the bottom of something, but also bringing reconciliation if possible. And so I think that when we're thinking about how we engage politically, how we're talking to one another, whether it's our brothers and sisters in Christ in the church, as well as colleagues who maybe don't share our faith, but we're still having political conversations with them, or at the Little League game, how are we contributing to asking hard questions, but in a very loving, respectful way, having direct conversations when they need to be had, but also thinking about the stuff that we talk about on the political front, making sure that it is in some ways proportionate to the level of relationship we have with that person. How much trust have I already worked to cultivate with them? So have I essentially earned a place to be able to talk with them about it, which feels so foreign in our world of oversharing nearly everything on social media and popping off with a lot of opinions. And I get that. I mean, I work in public policy. I'm paid to have opinions on some of these things. But even so, understanding that we're speaking with living, breathing other human beings who have family members who are maybe going through trials right now, who are maybe battling a disease, and we don't see all of that. And so making sure that we're bringing grace to the conversations that we do have with them.
As we've heard, it's important to approach conversations with people on different political spectrums with grace and gentleness. It's one thing to disagree with our brothers and sisters on issues, but we must learn from the past that engaging in toxic, hateful communication isn't profitable. Here's Yuval on why he thinks our society doesn't disagree constructively enough and how we can do better.
I think one way to think about that problem is in a sense that it's been all about rhetoric. We've thought about politics as an arena for rhetoric, for confrontational rhetoric, rather than as an arena for action, for negotiation and bargaining and pushing and pulling, which is what our politics really is all about. There's a way of thinking about this moment that we live in America that says we're disagreeing too much. I actually don't think that's quite right. I think we don't disagree constructively enough. And so our political rhetoric is not about policy disputes. It's about the wickedness and danger of the other side. Each side of our politics talks to itself about the other rather than talking to the other. And I think that is a function both of failures of the institutions that are supposed to facilitate direct confrontation, like Congress, but also like political journalism, even the academy, places where we're supposed to engage opposing ideas and confront them directly. And it is also a failure of our commitment to the actual process of politics, which is intended to be a working out of differences, not just a speaking out about differences. And so we have to find ways to raise the stakes. But I think we actually need to see that the stakes are not absolute, and that ultimately what we're doing at election time is filling a set of offices with people who are then going to have to work with each other. It's not the case that one side is just going to win decisively and the other side's going to go away. That's never how our politics works. And so I think our rhetoric needs to be better rooted in the institutional realities of American political life. And that would help us see that the stakes are actually lower than they might seem, and that ultimately the goal is to find ways to act together to address common problems. The goal is not to eliminate the people you disagree with. Too much of our political rhetoric seems to assume that eliminating the other side is an option or should be in our politics.
One factor that can contribute to negative political rhetoric is the spread of false truth and an increased lack of trust among institutions. Here's Jason Thacker to help us better understand the difference between mis- and disinformation and ways we can find and discern reliable and helpful information in the media.
Defining misinformation or disinformation, propaganda, things like conspiracy theories, fake news, is extremely important today because often what happens is these labels are used in unhelpful ways to deem any information that I don't like as essentially misinformation or disinformation or even a conspiracy theory. But the most basic level of misinformation is false or fake information that's spread unintentionally. The mis part, the MIS part of misinformation, says that it's unintentionally spread. Disinformation is a little different. There's actually an intentionality. Someone or something or some group wants to share information to intentionally deceive or to intentionally dissuade or to get people to act in a particular way. And reality is none of these things are all that new. These misinformation, propaganda, or whatever has been used for thousands and thousands of years throughout human history. But especially in our digital age, we've seen an exponential rise, not only in the accessibility of these type of tools. Think of anybody who has access to a smartphone and a little hint of rhetorical savviness can spread these things pretty wild. But also we're having an interesting kind of parallel with the rise of artificial intelligence, not only the ability to spread and to share these things on things like social media, but now even the questions of being able to create them at scale, which I think is a really unique recipe for kind of societal upheaval, especially over this next season, especially in the midst of a very contentious presidential election cycle. There's a deep inherent distrust in institutions and leaders and government kind of across the board. This isn't just a right issue, kind of politically right, or even a politically left issue. This is really an all of us issue. And it's actually one of the ways that we see technology forming and shaping us as people. It's shaping us in the sense that we don't know if we can trust the things that we see, whether it's things we're reading online or even with the rise of things like generative AI, talking about the things that we see in terms of video or even the audio we hear. There's this kind of deep level kind of skepticism, kind of a doubt. Can we really trust these things? Or is this just the powerful, kind of elite, wealthy, trying to shape and to form and to kind of lead the masses towards a particular end? One of the ways that we can start to combat these things and to find kind of discernible, reliable type of information is to slow down a little bit. It sounds really trite, but one of the things about technology is that it is always about more, faster, better, stronger. It's always about efficiency and convenience. We think about all of the information we're exposed to throughout the day, whether it's a breaking news alert on someone's phone right now as they're listening to this. It's often not very breaking, and it's often not even news. What's it trying to do? These companies, these institutions, these platforms are trying to get our attention. They're trying to get us to look at something. They're trying to get us to do something. We are inundated. We are overwhelmed by the amount of information that we're exposed to every day. And people know that. And that's one of the reasons that disinformation, conspiracy theories like that can thrive in our society, is because we simply can't handle the amount of information that we experience. Part of this idea of wisdom and virtue and discernment is to slow down, to question, to say, I don't know the answer to that right now, because we don't want to be Christians that are unintentionally even spreading fake information. Create a little discernment and virtue, and to ask the hard questions to make sure the things that we're saying or the things that we're sharing are actually true before we share them with other people.
With the rise of misinformation in our society, it's critically important for us to exercise discernment. Brooke and Yuval share why they advocate for an increased variety of media consumption to better decipher truth from misinformation.
Discernment, or the need to discern things, is critically important, not only in an election year, but especially in an election year. We have seen, especially since social media has become one of the dominant ways that we communicate with fellow citizens, we've seen how a lack of discernment and sort of the spread of information that might not be thoroughly vetted has caused a lot of rifts, not only just within political parties and with institutions, but within people's relationships, even within families, friend groups. I think that really one of the most practical ways I would advise us approach media consumption is to increase our variety of it. And that doesn't mean that we are going to agree with all of the outlets equally, because I deal with media on a very regular basis. What I find is oftentimes the truth generally lies somewhere in the middle of some of these stories, but also just bearing in mind that a lot of news outlets and a lot of reporters are covering many, many stories at one time, realizing journalists in and of themselves they're stretched thin sometimes. And so they can't cover it as thoroughly as it warrants sometimes. So showing some grace on that front too.
I think the lack of trust in institutions, and of course the media is just one institution we're losing trust in, but we're losing trust in a lot, has a lot to do with a lack of restraint by people with authority within those institutions. They use their positions as platforms for political expression rather than as ways of carrying out the particular work of the institution. And I think in some ways that's especially true in the media, so that I would say that in looking for trustworthy outlets of news, you should look for voices that acknowledge the limits of their knowledge, that draw distinctions between facts and opinions. Very difficult to do now. And frankly, a lot of the work that has to be done because there are so few such voices is work that has to be done by all of us, by citizens, through seeking out varied sources of information and making judgments among them. If we're stuck in a place where there are only partisan voices, then at the very least we have to seek out different partisan voices, think about how things look to people we don't agree with or don't share our view, try to reach outside of our bubble a little bit. The real danger in this media environment is just living in a bubble and accepting a picture of the world that is incomplete and that therefore leaves you uninformed. I think we are all at risk of doing that all the time. And it takes real work to go out of our way and try to hear what things sound like in a world full of people that we don't agree with. Sometimes they're unpleasant and it takes work to reach into them. But I think that if we really want to be informed citizens, we have to do a little bit of that.
Though politics can seem daunting, we must not lose hope and retreat from the political arena. Here's Yuval with his expectations for what this presidential election might mean for American politics and why that can be good news.
I think of this election year as something more like the end of a phase of American political life than a beginning. It's hard not to think of it that way because we have two 80-year-olds running for president. Both of them have been president. It's a very unusual situation. We've never really had it before. My expectation is that this year is going to be pretty rough for our politics and our political culture. It's going to put on display the problems we need to be solving rather than addressing those problems. And the question is what comes next. A lot of my work is focused on that question, on how the next phase of American politics can be more constructive and more healthy. That means trying to help Congress work better. The failures of Congress are really at the center of a lot of our political dysfunction. It means helping people understand our system better. And so thinking about what civics education can look like and what citizen education can look like. It means helping to focus our politics a little more on some of the substantive needs of our society, and so turning it in a more policy-minded direction and rebuilding the case for a politics of constructive disagreement. I think that's where we need attention. I don't expect this election season to advance that cause. I think it's only going to show us why we need it rather than showing us the way forward. But whoever wins will have a pretty constrained mandate, and 4 years is only 4 years. I don't think that our country has just 4 years to live. I think thinking about the future means hoping for the best in this election, but thinking beyond it and thinking about how a generational transition in American political life, the empowerment of political figures who are in middle age and younger and who think about the future as somewhere they're going to live, could be a more functional politics for our society. Our country does fall into ruts like this, and we also come out of those ruts. Both of those things can happen faster than you think, and it does seem to me that there is reason to hope that we are witnessing the end of a phase of failure in American political life, but that we're also nearing the beginning of a phase that has a chance of serving us better, and that's what we should work for.
No matter where you find yourself today, know you're not alone in your concerns and questions related to the 2024 presidential election. Like you, we are seeking to live out our biblically informed convictions in the public square while trying to make sense of the current political chaos. As we face unknowns and legitimate concerns for our country, we can still be filled with hope because we know our work for the Lord is never in vain. Thank you for listening to this episode of the ERLC podcast. Join us next time as we discuss best practices for political engagement.